Hi, I'm Scott Mitchell from the Silver River Museum, and in our last video we talked about the history of Florida from the time right after the United States Civil War up to about 1910. Now this period of time saw tremendous changes in Florida, where it shifted from a very poor state that was devastated by the Civil War to a more modern state with railroads and telephones and even cars. Today's video covers the period between 1920 and the end of World War II, or about 1945. Now, the 10 years between 1910 and 1920 are left out between the two videos, and something very important happened during this decade, and I want to talk about that before we get started with today's video. So we need to start by giving a brief discussion about Florida's role during World War I. World War I was a devastating world war in which many of the countries around the globe were caught up in warfare in Europe. The war started in 1914, but the United States did not enter the war until 1917. Eventually, after about a year and a half of the U.S. fighting in Europe, the war ended in 1918. Florida's role during World War I, because of our nice climate, it doesn't get too cold here in the winter, and there was lots of open land, it was a great place for the military to build bases. Airplanes were brand new during World War I, and so there were lots of training airfields where the United States military would train new pilots to fly the airplanes. Many of the young pilots trained at Florida's airfields during World War I ended up flying over the skies of Europe, where they would engage in aerial combat or dogfights with German pilots in planes like the Sopwith Camel, which were open cockpit biplanes. And again, these were brand new inventions. So Florida's role during World War I was a lot like it would later be in World War II. Lots of training bases, and because of our sunny climate and warm winters, it was a great place to grow fruits and vegetables, which would be shipped over to Europe to help feed the soldiers. By the time the war ended in 1918, many of the soldiers that had been in Florida to train during the war actually were interested in coming back because they realized Florida was a nice place to live. So our lesson today covers the time from 1920 up to World War II. You'll hear the 1920s also referred to as the Roaring Twenties. This was a time of great prosperity in the United States, and many jobs had been created that included new things like benefits of insurance and vacation time and sick time. So people with these new jobs had extra income and extra time to take vacations with their families. You'll also remember from our last video that the automobile was a fairly new invention, and so by the 1920s, a lot of these families with good jobs could also afford automobiles. And in the winter up north, when it's cold and frozen, people would get into their automobiles and come to Florida on vacation. This was a new kind of tourism because prior to this time, you would have to take a train to get to Florida as a tourist. As more and more people traveled to Florida during the 20s, a phenomenon occurred called the Great Land Boom. And the land boom was basically a period of time between about 1920 and 1926, where lots and lots of real estate or land was sold, mainly to visitors from up north who were coming to Florida on vacation, oftentimes in their own cars or campers. And they would come down to Florida and they would want to get in on the land deals. They thought they could get rich quick by buying Florida land that they knew would be worth more money in a few years, and then perhaps they could resell it or maybe build a retirement home. During the Florida land boom, lots and lots of new houses were built, but also communities would actually create plans for entirely new cities out in the middle of nowhere, and they would send surveyors out to lay out roads and lots, and they would actually create cities in a matter of a few months and then try to sell visitors from up north a lot or a piece of real estate in that new city. Lots of these visitors who brought their own campers were called tin can tourists. It was a nickname for them because they would carry extra gas for their car or extra water for camping in these big tin cans that would be strapped to the sides of their automobiles or campers. The tin can tourists came by the thousands to Florida during the early 1920s to camp and vacation and to try to get rich quick during the land boom. Now, because there was so much land being sold, the states and the cities thought that it would last forever, so they began to borrow money from banks to build roads and new parks and all kinds of facilities to cater to all of the new people that they thought were going to move to their communities. In 1926, the land boom crashed or ended. Many of these counties and cities were left with big bills to pay for roads and parks without the tourists to pay the taxes to support them. This was the beginning of the Great Depression in Florida, which actually started a little bit early than the rest of the country. Toward the end of the 1920s, there were several things that happened in Florida that really caused things to take a turn for the worse. By the late 1920s, things were not looking so good in Florida. The great land boom turned into the land bust. That means it ended. Lots of people began to sell the property that they had bought, and not many people were buying new pieces of property because it was so expensive. The money was not there for the cities to pay the bills on the money that they had borrowed to build new roads and parks and all of those things, so things began to slow down tremendously. There was a little fly called the Mediterranean fruit fly that is not from Florida. It's an invasive species, and it hitchhiked over to Florida on cargo ships. And once in Florida, it got loose and began to reproduce and killed citrus trees and vegetable crops and nut trees, and it really impacted Florida's agriculture and cost Florida farmers tremendous amounts of money and destroyed crops. The Mediterranean fruit fly caused more and more people to lose money, which made things even worse. Then in 1926 and again in 1928, major hurricanes roared through South Florida. The hurricane of 26 wiped out Miami and Fort Lauderdale and even left ocean-going ships in the middle of downtown Miami stuck in the roads that had been washed up there during the storm. The hurricane of 1928 was even worse. It blew Lake Okeechobee out of its basin, which flooded surrounding areas and small farming communities like Moorhaven and Belle Glade. Thousands of people drowned and many, many acres of farmland was destroyed. For the United States, the Great Depression officially kicked off in 1929 when the stock market crashed. Many people and businesses lost everything. There was not enough money to go around, which meant that people couldn't be paid, so that they were laid off or fired from their jobs. No jobs and no money means that people can't pay their bills, they can't keep their electricity on or pay their rent for their house, and they couldn't even afford to buy food. During the Great Depression in Florida and across the rest of the United States, many, many people were homeless and hungry without a good home to live in or enough food to put on their table. The government stepped in and created job programs to try to put America back to work, but it took a full 10 years until 1939 for the United States and Florida to come out of the Great Depression. The thing that brought Florida out of the Great Depression was actually not any better. It was World War II. So in 1941, the Japanese attacked U.S. Navy forces in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and the day after, the United States entered the war, declaring war on Japan. During World War II, the United States and other countries were at war with Japan and Germany. And in 1945, the Allies, which the United States was part of, eventually won the war. Florida's role during World War II was much like it was in World War I. The warm winters and the abundance of open land in Florida was a perfect situation for the military to come down and build military bases to train soldiers and pilots and sailors to send them to war over in Europe or the Pacific. Lots of military bases popped up around Florida, and Florida's population almost doubled as the result of World War II. Because of all the new military bases and also factories that were producing equipment for the war, many, many workers came to Florida, and Florida was once again back to work. During World War II, German submarines patrolled the Atlantic Ocean off the east coast of Florida and actually sunk at least 24 ships right off the coast of Florida. People living along the east coast at night could see ships burning far off to sea. People in Florida, like the rest of the country, had to cut back on what they used during the war, so there were more supplies for the soldiers off fighting. So one example is fruits and vegetables. People would plant victory gardens in their backyards to raise their own vegetables so that more of the farm produce could be sent to the war effort to feed the troops. A lot of the workers that came to Florida stayed after the war, and many of the soldiers and sailors and airmen who had been in Florida for training before going off to war returned to Florida after they returned to the United States when the war was won. So this gives you a good overview of the basic facts about World War I and then the period in Florida between 1920 and 1945. Much like the last discussion, big changes in Florida took place during this time. And Florida was no longer a sparsely populated farming state. It was now a vacation destination, and many people wanted to retire here or come here every winter to pursue the Florida lifestyle. I hope this overview is helpful in your studies, and we look forward to seeing you back for more cool history facts at the Silver River Museum.